Montana Territory, November 1881. The first snow had already claimed 2 children in the valley. Hypothermia, the doctor said, though everyone knew the real killer was something simpler, cold that no amount of firewood could defeat. In a settlement where winter meant survival, where a single night below zero could end a family line, every cabin fought the same losing battle against the brutal mountain cold. But one man was building something different, something his neighbors called wasteful, something that made experienced frontiersmen shake their heads and mutter about old-world foolishness as they passed his property. Inside an already cramped log cabin, a Norwegian immigrant was constructing what looked like a wooden box, a room within a room. While other settlers maximized every square foot of living space, he was deliberately shrinking his. While they mocked him for wasting precious lumber on double walls, he kept working with the quiet determination of a man who'd seen this kind of cold before. What did he understand about heat that frontier-born Americans had missed? If you want to discover how ancient Scandinavian wisdom turned mockery into the survival blueprint that saved lives across Montana Territory, hit that subscribe button and comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to learn might just change how you think about warmth, shelter, and why sometimes the oldest solutions are the smartest ones. The hammering started before dawn, and it hadn't stopped for 3 weeks. Einar Haugen was 36 years old, broad-shouldered from years of fishing the Arctic waters off Tromsø, Norway, and stubborn in the way that only men who've survived above the Arctic Circle can be. He'd arrived in Montana Territory 8 months earlier with his wife Sigrid, their 2 young daughters, and a memory of cold that made the local stories about harsh winters sound like autumn evenings. His cabin sat at the eastern edge of the settlement, 20 feet by 24 feet of hand-hewn pine logs, chinked with moss and clay, a stone hearth occupying the north wall. Standard frontier construction. Practical, efficient, exactly like every other cabin in the valley. Except Einar was destroying that efficiency. Inside his main room, where families typically arranged beds, a table, storage, and living space with careful precision, Einar was building walls. New walls, creating a smaller structure entirely contained within the outer cabin, a box inside a box, as his neighbor had put it with barely concealed contempt. The interior room measured just 10 feet by 12 feet. It consumed nearly a third of his total living area. To the experienced homesteaders watching his progress, it was architectural madness. They'd spent years learning to maximize every inch of their cabins. Space meant survival, room to store food, tools, supplies, room for children to sleep away from the door's draft, room to live through 6-month winters when going outside meant risking frostbite in minutes. And Einar Haugen was throwing that space away. Building yourself a closet to live in. Daniel Krebs had called out 2 days earlier, genuine confusion in his voice. Krebs had survived 17 Montana winters. His cabin design had been copied by 6 other families. You've got babies, Einar. Where are they supposed to sleep? Where's your wife supposed to work? Einar had just nodded politely and continued measuring. He was cutting logs into precise 4-foot lengths, planing them smooth on 2 sides. The construction didn't match anything the American-born settlers recognized. It wasn't a room divider. Those were single walls, maybe a curtain. This had double walls with a gap between them, like he was building a fortress against some invisible enemy. The real mockery started when people saw what he was filling that gap with. Dried moss. Handfuls and handfuls of dried sphagnum moss, mixed with clay and something that looked like sawdust. He'd spent weeks gathering it from the high meadows, drying it in the autumn sun, preparing it like some precious resource. Then he'd stuff it carefully into the 8-inch cavity between his inner and outer walls, packing it down with a gentleness that seemed absurd for insulation material. Man's wasting lumber on double walls so he can fill them with swamp grass, muttered William Aldridge, the settlement's most experienced builder. Aldridge had constructed 11 cabins in the valley. His methods were proven, efficient, respected. That moss will rot by spring. Whole thing will need rebuilding. Should have listened to someone who knows this territory. But Einar hadn't come to Montana to learn about cold. He'd come from a place where winter was measured in months of darkness, where the sea froze solid, where entire communities survived in conditions that would kill unprepared men in hours. He'd grown up in a turf-roofed house where his family retreated into a small, heavily insulated room every night from October to April, where body heat and a single small stove could keep 6 people warm through Arctic storms. The frontier Americans saw waste. Einar saw something else entirely, a failure to understand what heat actually was, how it moved, and how you could trap it. His inner room was taking shape now. The walls were complete, double-layered, moss-packed, sealed. He positioned the structure directly adjacent to the main cabin's stone hearth, sharing one wall with the firebox. That wall would be his heat source, his thermal anchor. The other 3 walls would hold that heat inside, prevent it from bleeding into the larger, colder space of the main cabin. "You're just making yourself a smaller cabin inside a bigger one," Sarah Hendricks had observed, watching through the open door. "Why not just build a smaller cabin to start with?" Einar had smiled at that, the first time anyone had asked a question instead of offering criticism. Because, he'd said in his heavy accent, "The box outside keeps the wind away. The box inside keeps the warmth close. 2 jobs, 2 boxes." They nodded like they understood, but their eyes said they didn't. To them, warmth meant fire. More warmth. Bigger fire, bigger warmth. The idea that you could be warmer with less fire, simply by changing the shape of your space, didn't fit their experience. By mid-November, the structure was finished. Einar had built a small door, just 5 feet high, requiring adults to duck when entering. Inside, he'd arranged 2 narrow beds, a tiny table, and a small shelf. The ceiling was low, maybe 6.5 feet at its peak. The single window was small, double-glazed with salvaged glass he'd traded for. Everything about the space violated the frontier principle of openness and maximum utility. His wife, Sigrid, seemed to understand, though. She'd grown up in Bergen, in houses where families gathered in the stew, the warm room, every evening. She'd helped pack the moss, had sewn heavy wool curtains for the doorway. When Einar finished, she'd hung those curtains carefully, creating another layer between the warm interior and the cold outer cabin. Winter's coming early this year. Daniel Krebs had mentioned the day Einar completed his box. The observation carried weight. Krebs could read weather signs better than most. "Hope that little room of yours works out, because it's going to be a cold one." What Krebs meant, what everyone meant, was simpler. "Hope you don't freeze to death in that closet you built while the rest of us stay warm in our real cabins." Einar had just nodded. He'd felt this kind of cold before, and he knew something they didn't. In the truly brutal cold, space was the enemy. Volume was the killer. Every cubic foot of air you tried to heat was warmth stolen from your body. The real question wasn't whether his small room would work. The question was whether the Americans' big, open cabins would fail. While his neighbors dismissed the inner room as foreign eccentricity, Einar Haugen was executing engineering principles refined over centuries of Arctic survival. The design was deceptively simple, but every dimension mattered. His main cabin, the outer structure, measured 20 feet by 24 feet with 8-foot ceilings. Total volume, approximately 3,840 cubic feet of space. In a Montana winter dropping to 20 or 30 below zero, heating that volume meant burning massive amounts of wood just to raise the temperature from uninhabitable to merely cold. Most frontier cabins achieved indoor temperatures between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest nights, even with fires burning continuously. The inner room, what Einar called the Warmest in Norwegian, changed that equation entirely. 10 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling just 6.5 feet high. Total volume, 780 cubic feet, 1/5 the space of the main cabin. But the reduction in volume was only the beginning of its efficiency. The walls told the real story. Einar had constructed each wall as a double-layer assembly. The outer layer, 4-inch pine planks, fitted tight, the same construction as the main cabin's interior walls. Then came the critical innovation, an 8-inch gap carefully maintained with wooden spacers every 2 feet. That gap was filled with dried sphagnum moss mixed with clay and fine wood shavings in roughly equal proportions. To frontier builders, this seemed like wasteful complexity. Why use twice the lumber and fill the gap with plant matter when a single solid wall would be stronger. But Einar understood something about heat transfer that his critics didn't. Air trapped in small pockets is one of nature's finest insulators. The moss wasn't just filler. Each strand of sphagnum created tiny air cavities, thousands of microscopic pockets where air sat motionless. The clay added structural stability and fire resistance. The wood shavings created additional air gaps while allowing any moisture to wick away from the moss, preventing rot. The entire 8-inch assembly functioned as a thermal barrier far superior to solid wood. Wood alone conducts heat at roughly 0.12 W/mK. The moss-filled cavity assembly, closer to 0.04 W/mK, 3 times more insulating. Einar couldn't have articulated it in those terms, but he'd lived the results. He knew that walls built this way turn a room into a heat vessel, a container that released warmth slowly over hours instead of minutes. The positioning was equally calculated. He'd built the Warmest against the cabin's north wall, sharing a common surface with the stone hearth's back. This wasn't the hearth's front, not the firebox opening where flames roared and heat radiated directly outward. This was the massive back wall of stacked sandstone, 2 feet thick, weighing roughly 4,000 pounds. During the day, when the main cabin's fire burned for cooking and warmth, that stone wall absorbed heat steadily, its temperature climbing slowly but persistently. By evening, the stones would be warm to the touch, not burning hot, but radiating gentle, consistent heat. That radiation passed through into the Warmest. The shared wall became a heat source that required no additional fuel, no tending, no active management. It was passive thermal transfer, the stone releasing stored energy gradually into the small, heavily insulated space. The other 3 walls of the Warmest prevented that heat from escaping. The insulated barriers didn't conduct heat outward into the main cabin. They held it inside, trapped in that 780 cubic feet of air. The result was a compounding effect. Small volume meant less air to heat. Insulated walls meant heat couldn't escape. Thermal mass from the shared stone wall meant continuous, gentle warming even as the main fire died down. Each element multiplied the other's efficiency. Einar had added one more refinement that seemed pointless to observers. The door, just 5 feet tall, requiring anyone entering to duck. And it wasn't a normal door. It was double-layered, with a 3-inch gap between the panels filled with more moss insulation. Heavy wool curtains hung inside and outside the door frame. "Why'd you make the doors so small?" young Timothy Aldridge had asked, genuinely curious rather than mocking. At 14, he hadn't yet learned to dismiss things he didn't understand. "Heat rises," Einar had explained, gesturing upward. "Warm air stays at ceiling. Cold air stays at floor. Small door up high. Less warm air escapes when you open. Curtains catch what tries to leave." It was basic fluid dynamics, though Einar would never have used that term. Warm air, being less dense, stratified toward the ceiling. A standard 6.5-foot door opening would release the warmest air at the top when opened. A 5-foot door, with curtains creating a barrier above it, trapped that warm layer even when people passed through. The window presented a challenge. Glass was the weakest thermal barrier in any frontier cabin. But Einar had installed 2 panes with a 1-inch air gap between them, creating primitive double glazing. During the coldest nights, he could lower an insulated wooden shutter from inside, adding another barrier. The window was small, just 18 inches square, providing light without creating a heat loss surface. By late November, the physics of the structure were complete, even if no one else recognized them. The Warmest was a thermal battery, a heat trap, a survival chamber engineered according to principles developed in Earth's harshest inhabited climates. But engineering principles don't convince skeptics. Social proof does. Visible results do. Comparative performance in crisis does. Einar's room needed a test. The kind of test that made the difference between theory and survival obvious to everyone. Winter was coming, and it would be brutal. The criticism started as jokes, but hardened into something more serious as autumn progressed toward winter. William Aldrich was the man whose opinion mattered most. At 52, he'd been building cabins in Montana Territory since 1869, before most current settlers had arrived. He'd survived the winter of 1871, when temperatures hit 52 below and 3 families froze to death in their beds. He designed the settlement's common storehouse, engineered its root cellars, and personally instructed 11 families on proper cabin construction. When Aldrich said something about building, people listened, and Aldrich thought Einar Haugen was making a dangerous mistake. Talked to the Norwegian yesterday. He'd mentioned to a group gathered at the general store in early December. Try to explain why that inner room won't work. Man's well-intentioned, but he doesn't understand this climate. The irony of telling a Norwegian immigrant that he didn't understand cold was lost on Aldrich. Montana winters were brutal. Everyone agreed on that. But they weren't Arctic winters. They were different, which to Aldrich meant the solutions had to be different too. The problem is heat circulation, Aldrich explained, sketching on a scrap of paper. A cabin needs air movement. Fire heats air. Hot air rises and spreads. You build boxes inside boxes. You trap the heat in one spot. Rest of the space stays cold. His wife and daughters sleeping in the main room. They'll freeze while he's warm in his little fort. It was a reasonable concern based on reasonable assumptions about how warmth worked. Fire in the center, heat radiating outward, the entire space warming gradually. That was the frontier model, proven over decades. Plus, he's using half his firewood, just heating stone he can't even see, added Samuel Hendricks, the settlement's carpenter. Hendricks had built Einar's main cabin frame, and he'd been quietly offended when Einar started modifying it. That hearth backs into his warm room. All that heat from the fire's back wall is going into an empty space instead of into the cabin where people live. It's backwards. The technical criticism carried weight. These men had survived by learning this environment, adapting European building techniques to Montana's specific challenges. They'd experimented, failed, refined. Their methods worked most of the time. Einar's approach violated their tested principles. Saw the moss insulation he used. Mentioned Jacob Reeves, who operated the settlement's sawmill. That stuff will compact down, leave gaps. Come February, he'll have drafts cutting through those walls worse than no insulation at all. And if it gets damp, rot, mold, whole thing will have to come down by spring. The men weren't being cruel. They were genuinely concerned. Einar had 2 young daughters, Anna, 5, and Greta, 3. His wife Sigrid was pregnant with a 3rd child. The family couldn't afford a failed experiment in winter housing. Someone should talk to him serious. Aldrich said finally. Not making fun, really explain it. Because what he's built might work for one man sleeping alone. But a family? With children? That little room can't hold everyone. And the main cabin, with all that space given over to his box, won't heat properly either. He's made himself the worst of both. Daniel Krebs, who generally stayed out of building debates, had actually gone to speak with Einar directly. He'd stood in the cabin, examined the Warmest, tried to understand the logic. It's too small, he'd said gently. Einar, I know you mean well. But look, your whole family can't sleep in there. It's maybe big enough for 2 beds, pressed tight. Where do the girls go? Where does your wife cook, work, live during the day? Einar had tried to explain. The main cabin was for daytime, cooking, working, living. The Warmest was for nighttime, for sleeping when the cold was deadliest. The girls would sleep there, warm, while he and Sigrid tended the fire in the main room. Or the whole family could retreat there during the brutal, deep cold, living in close quarters for short periods, staying warm. But the explanation sounded weak even as he gave it. Retreat into a box and wait out the cold? That wasn't the frontier way. The frontier way was to conquer the environment, heat your space, live normally despite the weather. You're thinking like you're still in Norway, Krebs had said, not unkindly. But this isn't Norway. We figure out what works here. Bigger fireplace, more wood, proper circulation. You don't need to hide in a closet. You need to heat your whole home. The women's criticism was more practical and more cutting. Where does she wash clothes in winter? Martha Aldrich had asked. Where do the children play? That main room, with that box taking up half of it, there's barely space for a table. She's going to spend 6 months living in a hallway around her husband's experiment. My daughters would go mad, cooped up in a space that small, added Eliza Krebs. Children need room to move, especially in winter when they're trapped inside. The social pressure was building. It wasn't just that people thought Einar was wrong. They thought he was being stubborn in a way that would hurt his family, that he was clinging to old-world methods instead of learning from people who'd mastered this specific environment. By mid-December, the settlement had essentially divided into 2 camps, those who actively criticized the Warmest and those who just shook their heads and stayed quiet. Nobody, not one person, thought it would work better than standard frontier construction. Winter will teach him, Aldridge had said finally. Man has to learn sometime. Just hope the lesson isn't too hard on those little girls. The assumption was clear. When the real cold came, Einar would realize his mistake. He'd abandon the inner room, move his family back to normal sleeping arrangements, and probably spend next summer tearing out those double walls to reclaim his living space. The settlement had seen stubborn men before. Montana had a way of breaking stubbornness, of proving that local knowledge beat imported theories. What none of them considered, what their experience couldn't let them consider, was that maybe, just maybe, a man from Tromsø understood something about extreme cold that Montana-born settlers had never needed to learn. Because Montana winters were harsh, but they weren't Arctic. Not usually. The temperature started dropping on January 4th, 1882, and it didn't stop. By January 6th, the thermometer outside Daniel Krebs's cabin read minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. By January 8th, minus 36. On January 9th, the mercury in the thermometer contracted so far down the tube that Krebs had to bring it inside to read it properly, minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit. And it kept falling. This wasn't a normal Montana cold snap, the kind that hit hard for a night or two, then eased. This was sustained, crushing, lethal cold. The kind that made trees explode with rifle crack sounds as their sap froze and expanded. The kind that turned breath into ice crystals before it could disperse. The kind that killed. On January 10th, William Aldridge measured minus 47 degrees before sunrise. The air hurt to breathe. Stepping outside, even fully dressed, felt like walking into a wall of knives. And it lasted. 6 consecutive nights below minus 40. 12 consecutive nights below minus 30. The sustained cold was worse than the absolute temperature. There was no relief, no warming period to recover, no chance for cabins to rebuild their heat reserves. Inside the settlement's cabins, the battle for survival became arithmetic. How much wood could you burn per hour? How fast could you feed the fire? How cold would your cabin get if you let the fire die down for even 1 hour to sleep? The answers were terrifying. Martha and William Aldridge burned through 2.5 cords of wood in the first 4 days. Their cabin, considered one of the best designed in the settlement, maintained an indoor temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit by the morning of January 11th, despite a fire that had been burning continuously for 90 hours. 32 degrees. Freezing. Inside. The girls' water bucket had ice on it this morning. Martha reported to the other women at the midday gathering on January 11th. The women had started meeting daily at the general store, the only building with a large enough stove to provide genuine warmth. Ice. Inside our cabin, with the fire going. The Krebs family was doing marginally better. Their cabin stayed around 38 degrees, but Daniel was burning wood so fast he'd already cut into the reserves he'd planned to last until March. At this rate, he'd run out by February, and the cold wasn't easing. The children were suffering worst. 9-year-old Samuel Hendricks developed frostbite on 3 fingers from the 60 seconds it took him to run from the cabin to the outhouse. 4-year-old Mary Reeves wouldn't stop crying, her feet too cold despite 2 pairs of wool socks and being wrapped in blankets. Young Timothy Aldridge, the 14-year-old who'd asked Einar about the door, came down with what his mother feared was pneumonia. The boy couldn't get warm, even sleeping next to the fire. His coughing echoed through the thin cabin walls. On the morning of January 12th, Daniel Krebs found his neighbor, old Henry Sutton, dead in his bed. Hypothermia. Inside his cabin, with a fire that had burned down to coals sometime in the night. The settlement was facing a crisis beyond anything the current generation had experienced. This wasn't pioneer hardship or frontier difficulty. This was people dying inside their homes. "We need to consolidate," Aldridge announced at an emergency gathering on January 12th. "Families double up. 2 or 3 families per cabin, share body heat, share firewood. We can't all maintain separate fires in this cold." It was a desperate measure. Frontier families value their privacy, their independence. But independence meant nothing to dead children. People started moving that afternoon. The Hendricks family moved in with the Reeves. The Krebs opened their cabin to 2 single men who'd been barely surviving in a dugout shelter. The Aldridges took in a widow and her teenage son. The consolidation helped. More bodies meant more warmth, more people to tend fires around the clock. But the cabins were still desperately cold. "Anyone checked on the Norwegian?" someone asked on January 13th. There was an uncomfortable silence. In the chaos of survival, people had forgotten about Einar Haugen. His cabin sat a quarter-mile from the main cluster, far enough that no one had seen smoke from his chimney since the cold began. Far enough that no one wanted to make the dangerous walk to check. "Probably frozen," someone muttered. Him and his whole family. That full room of his. But no one wanted to check. The cold made every journey potentially fatal, and there was an unspoken assumption. If Einar had needed help, he would have come to them. Want to see what they found when they finally made it to Einar's cabin? Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us the coldest temperature you've ever experienced. Because what happened next changed everything these frontier experts thought they knew about surviving extreme cold. On the morning of January 14th, Daniel Krebs decided someone had to check on the Haugen family. The walk from his cabin to Einar's took 12 minutes in good weather. In -42-degree cold, with wind cutting across open ground, it felt like a death march. Krebs wrapped wool scarves around his face until only his eyes showed, pulled 2 pairs of mittens over his hands, and started out. The world had transformed into something alien. Snow didn't fall. It was too cold for snow. Instead, ice crystals hung suspended in the air, creating glittering clouds that caught the weak morning light. Every breath burned. Every exposed inch of skin stung within seconds. Krebs had made it halfway when he saw smoke. Not the thick, heavy smoke of a roaring fire. Thin smoke. Light smoke. The kind that suggested a small fire, banked low, barely burning. The kind that shouldn't be able to heat anything in this cold. He quickened his pace, fear driving him forward. If Einar's fire had died down that far, the family was likely dead or dying. He reached the cabin and pounded on the door. No answer. He pounded again, harder, terrorizing. Then he heard it. A child's laugh. High, clear, unmistakable. The door opened. Warmth hit Krebs like a physical wall. Actual warmth. Warm air rolled out through the doorway, carrying with it the smell of cooking porridge and wood smoke. He stood frozen, partly from shock, partly from the temperature contrast making his exposed skin burn. Einar stood in the doorway, wearing a light wool shirt. Not a heavy coat, not multiple layers. A shirt like it was autumn. "Daniel," Einar said, concern crossing his face. "You are well? Come in, please." Too cold outside. Krebs stumbled inside, and the door closed behind him. The outer cabin, the main room, felt cool but not cold. Maybe 45, 50 degrees. Comfortable enough that you wouldn't need to huddle near a fire. Comfortable enough that water wouldn't freeze. But that wasn't what stopped Krebs' cold. The inner door to the Warmest was open, and inside, visible through the doorway, Sigrid Haugen was braiding young Anna's hair. Both girls sat at the small table in their nightgowns, eating breakfast. The family's small dog lay sprawled on the floor like it was summer. How? Krebs couldn't form the question. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. Einar picked up a simple mercury thermometer from the table, the kind that every settler used to track the outside cold, to know when it was too dangerous to venture out. Inside the Warmest, Einar said quietly, showing Krebs the reading. 68 degrees. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Krebs stared at the thermometer like it was showing him something impossible. Outside, -42. Inside Einar's small room, 68. A difference of 110 degrees. That can't be right, Krebs said. But he could feel it. Even standing in the outer cabin, he could feel the warmth radiating from the inner room. His frozen face was starting to ache as it thawed. The main room, here where we stand now, Einar continued, gesturing around the outer cabin, stays at 47, 48 degrees. Cool, yes, but not dangerous, not freezing. And the Warmest, he gestured toward the inner room with something like pride. The Warmest is warm. Krebs stepped closer to the Warmest doorway. The temperature difference was palpable, like approaching a stove, but gentler, steadier. The warmth wasn't aggressive. It was pervasive, even. How much wood are you burning? Krebs asked, because that was the equation everyone was fighting, wood consumption versus temperature maintained. Einar walked to his woodpile. It was neat, stacked carefully along the outer cabin's west wall. Still substantial. Since the cold began, Einar said, 8 days ago, I have burned about 3/4 of a cord. Krebs did the math in his head. 3/4 of a cord in 8 days. He'd burned 2.5 cords in the same period, and his cabin was barely maintaining 38 degrees. Einar was using less than 1/3 the wood and achieving nearly twice the warmth. That's impossible, Krebs said again, but his conviction was weakening. The evidence was undeniable. The family was warm. The children were healthy, playing, laughing. Sigrid was cooking breakfast without huddling near the fire for warmth. The dog was asleep, comfortable. The stone wall, Einar explained, leading Krebs to the hearth. He placed his hand on the back of the stone fireplace, the side that faced into the Warmest. Feel. Krebs removed his mitten and touched the stone. It was warm, not hot, but genuinely warm, like a sun-heated rock on a summer afternoon. Fire heats the stone during the day, Einar said. Stone holds heat. Stone gives heat back slowly all night. Into the Warmest. The walls. He gestured to the moss-packed, double walls. They keep that heat inside. No escape. The heat stays where we sleep. It was so simple, so obvious, and so completely contrary to everything the frontier builders had developed. How long does it stay warm? Krebs asked. After the fire dies down, how long? Einar smiled. Last night, I let the fire go out at 10 o'clock. To test. This morning at 9, he checked a pocket watch. 11 hours later, the Warmest was still 61 degrees. The stone wall was still warm. Not hot, but warm. 11 hours of heat retention. Without adding fuel. Without tending the fire. Just thermal mass and insulation working exactly as centuries of Arctic engineering had proven they would. Krebs sank into a chair in the outer cabin. His mind was reeling. Everything he believed about heating a cabin, everything the settlement's experts had taught, everything they'd mocked Einar for ignoring, it was wrong. Not completely wrong, but wrong for this level of cold. The others, Krebs said quietly, were consolidating families, sharing cabins, sharing fires. People are still freezing. William Aldridge's cabin got down to 32 degrees yesterday. Inside, Henry Sutton died. Einar's face fell. Henry? I did not know. I am sorry. We thought you'd frozen too, Krebs admitted. Your chimney smoke was so light. We thought the fire had died, and you with it. Small fire is enough, Einar said. That is what I tried to explain. You do not need big fire if you keep the heat close. Big cabin, big fire. Small room, small fire. But small fire and small room can be warmer than big fire and big cabin. It violated intuition, but it was true. Krebs stood up, his own cabin calling to him. His family, cold and miserable, burning through their wood reserves. And here was a man who'd solved the problem weeks ago, while everyone mocked him. Can I burn my family here? Krebs asked. The question came out more desperate than he'd intended. Would you have room? We're burning through what we don't have, and the cabin won't stay warm. And Einar held up a hand. No need. I will come to your cabin. I will show you. We can build a small warm room in your cabin. Not as complete as this. No time for full double walls. But we can make a sleeping room. Insulated. Near your hearth. Enough to keep your family safe. Over the next hour, Einar explained the principles to Krebs. The thermal mass concept. The insulation strategy. The volume reduction. The heat retention. It wasn't magic or foreign mystery. It was engineering. Physics. The same laws that governed all heat transfer, applied with the wisdom of people who'd survived far worse than Montana winters. When Krebs finally left to return to his cabin, he carried more than knowledge. He carried hope. And he carried a story that would spread through the settlement faster than the cold that had killed Henry Sutton. The Norwegians' crazy box worked. It worked better than anything they'd built, and people were about to stop laughing. The transformation started immediately. By the evening of January 14th, William Aldrich was at Einar's cabin, hat literally in hand, asking to see the Warmest. Aldrich spent 2 hours examining every detail: the double walls, the moss insulation, the shared thermal mass wall, the low ceiling, the small door, the thick curtains. "I was wrong," Aldrich said simply. It was the closest thing to an apology his pride would allow. "Can you help us build these? For the families that need them most." Einar agreed. What followed was a remarkable feat of community cooperation driven by pure survival necessity. Working in shifts, because the cold still made outdoor work deadly, teams of men began constructing simplified warm rooms in the settlement's cabins. They couldn't replicate Einar's full double-wall design in midwinter, but they adapted the principles. Single insulated walls, moss-packed where possible, positioned against existing hearths, low ceilings, small doors. The Krebs family got the first conversion. Working inside their cabin across 3 days, Einar and Daniel built an 8 by 10-foot warm room against their stone hearth. They used single walls packed with moss gathered from under the snow, sealed with clay. They hung heavy wool blankets as both door and ceiling insulation. The results were immediate. The Krebs family's wood consumption dropped by half. The interior temperature of their warm room stabilized at 62 degrees, 30 degrees warmer than their main cabin had been achieving. The children stopped crying from the cold. Daniel's wife, Elizabeth, cried for a different reason when she realized her family would survive the winter. By January 20th, 6 cabins had warm rooms. By January 25th, 12. Not every family. Some cabins lacked the space or the right hearth configuration, but enough to matter. The temperature records from that winter, preserved in Daniel Krebs's journal, tell the story quantitatively. Standard frontier cabin, example. Aldrich house before modification average interior temperature during extreme cold. 35 degrees Fahrenheit wood consumption. 3 to 4 cords per month morning low. After night fire died, down 28 degrees Fahrenheit modified cabin with warm room. Example. Krebs house after conversion, main cabin average. 42 degrees Fahrenheit warm room average. 64 degrees Fahrenheit wood consumption. 1.5 to 2 cords per month morning low in. Warm room. 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The statistics mattered less than the human outcomes. That winter saw 7 cold-related deaths in the Montana Territory settlements within a 100-mile radius. In Einar's immediate settlement, after the warm room conversions, 0. Not one child developed life-threatening frostbite after mid-January. Not one family ran out of wood before spring. Not one person froze in their sleep. The social consequences rippled outward for years. By spring 1882, travelers were deliberately routing through the settlement to examine the Norwegian warm rooms. Builders from 3 neighboring valleys visited to learn the technique. The methodology spread, adapted, modified, merged with German stew concepts and Russian pechka designs from other immigrant communities. By 1885, local building ordinances, informal but followed, recommended warm room construction in any cabin expected to house families during winter. Daniel Krebs, who'd almost dismissed Einar entirely, became one of the technique's most vocal advocates, teaching the principles to new settlers. William Aldrich did something remarkable. He publicly apologized. At the spring 1882 community meeting, in front of the assembled settlement, he stood and addressed Einar directly. "I called your building methods foolish," Aldrich said. "I said you didn't understand our climate. I was wrong on both counts. You understood cold better than any of us because you'd lived through worse. And you understood humility. You didn't argue with us. You just built what you knew worked. You saved lives this winter, probably mine included. Thank you." The settlement gave Einar a standing ovation. But perhaps the most telling legacy came from the children who grew up in those warm rooms. Anna and Greta Haugen, who'd slept comfortably through the worst winter in Montana Territory history, would later tell their own children's stories about the winter when Papa's little room saved the valley. Those children would incorporate warm room principles into their own homes decades later. The technique never fully replaced standard frontier cabin design. As the territory developed, as sawmills made lumber cheaper, as coal and later oil heating became available, the desperate necessity faded. Warm rooms became optional, then old-fashioned, then forgotten by most. But in the historical record, in the journals kept by people like Daniel Krebs, in the survival rates of that brutal winter, the evidence remains clear. Sometimes the most sophisticated engineering comes not from innovation, but from remembering what extreme environments already taught humanity. Einar Haugen hadn't invented anything. He'd simply refused to forget. The frontier experts had assumed that their experience made them authorities. That local knowledge trumped imported techniques. That a Norwegian fisherman couldn't possibly understand Montana winters better than men who'd survived Montana winters. They'd made the eternal mistake, confusing familiarity with mastery. Einar understood something they hadn't needed to learn. In truly extreme cold, the kind that kills in hours, not days, you don't conquer the environment. You don't heat vast spaces and prove your dominance over nature. You get small. You get efficient. You work with heat's fundamental properties instead of fighting them. You remember that humans survived the Arctic long before they invented central heating. The warm room wasn't a frontier hack or a clever trick. It was engineering refined over centuries by people who couldn't afford mistakes because mistakes meant death. It was the accumulated wisdom of cultures that learned to thrive in Earth's harshest climates. And when Montana Territory briefly, brutally, became that kind of environment, that wisdom proved itself against frontier pride. The lesson extended beyond building techniques. It spoke to how communities learn, how they integrate new knowledge, how they balance confidence in proven methods against humility before new information. Einar's neighbors have laughed because they assumed competence meant doing things the way successful people did them. They'd missed that competence actually meant understanding principles deeply enough to adapt them to new extremes. By the time spring arrived and the settlement could gather for a proper community meeting, the mockery had transformed into respect. The crazy Norwegian's box had become the warm room technique. The man they dismissed as stubborn and ignorant had become the settlement's informal cold-weather engineering consultant. Sarah Hendricks, who'd questioned where Sigrid would wash clothes, admitted she'd been asking the wrong question. "I was thinking about convenience," she told Sigrid that spring. "You were thinking about survival. There's a difference. I should have understood that." The settlement learned another lesson, too, that immigrants weren't bringing inferior old-world methods that needed correcting. They were bringing solutions developed for problems that the frontier might face but hadn't yet experienced at full severity. The hubris of pioneering, the assumption that taming new land meant discarding old knowledge, had nearly killed them. The humility to learn from someone with harder-won experience had saved them. When historians later studied the winter of 1882 in Montana Territory, they noted it as one of the coldest on record. They documented the death toll. They recorded the survival strategies that emerged. But they often missed the deeper story, that survival wasn't about who could endure more suffering or burn more resources. It was about who could remember that humans had already solved these problems centuries ago, in places even harsher than Montana. Einar Haugen's warm room wasn't a miracle. It was memory. It was respect for the hard-won knowledge of people who'd faced killing cold long before Montana Territory existed. And when that knowledge proved superior to frontier confidence, it revealed a truth about expertise itself. Sometimes the wisest answer to, "How do we survive this?" is ask someone who already has. What traditional survival technique would you want to learn next? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you found this story valuable, hit that subscribe button because there are dozens more forgotten frontier innovations waiting to be rediscovered. The past wasn't primitive. It was brilliant. We just forgot to keep listening.